again, I'd like to welcome you, Priscilla. I'm very grateful that you agreed to give this presentation. I have read both of your books, and Where Privacy Dies. Was that released in 2018?
Yes.
Right, and that's the first of the Twin Cities mystery. And then this second one, Should Grace Fail? Released,
Yes.
as you said, due to some delays, December 2020. They are available at the local bookstore. I also have some questions for you, but I'm going to let you take the lead. And if I can help in any way, please let me know. I'm going to mute otherwise myself, okay?
Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the invitation. I really appreciate everyone signing on. And yes, the newest, is Should Grace Fail, available in a paperback edition and also as an ebook. If many of you are probably in Minnesota right now, I know Carolyn is, and I don't know what the weather is like in Connecticut, Carol, but I understand, because I have relatives in Maine, that there's been a lot of dumping of snow on New England. But one thing about living in states like Minnesota and New England, if you write mysteries, it's wonderful because you can do almost anything with the weather. You can have it killingly cold, it can be terribly, hot, so hot people pass out. It can be deceptively nice. You could have a straight line wind come through. It's like Raymond Chandler always said, if you want to shake things up, have two men enter with guns. But in climates like this, you could just simply have a tree come through the roof, or suddenly the house starts creaking in a scary way just because the temperature is changing so rapidly. But anyway, thanks for joining me on this, what here is a very cold day. And yes, I have lived in Northfield for over 15 years now. And in a way, being in Northfield is what started me writing on mysteries, and I'll explain that in a minute. My background is I was born in Vermont, a state in which I never ever lived, but was raised in Maine. Both sides of the family had a lot of Scot background. But for the sake of argument, we'll say I met in graduate school, a Midwesterner with Scandinavian, particularly Norwegian heritage. Well, somehow that ended up with us back here. And yes, his side of the family is very much Norwegian with a tiny bit of Swedish. And if you count extended in-laws, a little bit of German. So needless to say, if you live in Northfield, you know that Scandinavian noir is very popular here. And, starting maybe about 10, 12 years ago, it really hit a peak of popularity with The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo series by Stieg Larsson. Henning Mankel's Wallander, I read those. My husband read those. They were really great. And then there was the BBC production with Kenneth Branagh, right? And also a little bit darker, Jo Nesbo, who writes mysteries set in Norway. Anyway, everybody, by everybody, I mean, all the Scandinavian Americans around me were reading these and recommending them. And I may have started making fun of them. I may have said, oh, let me guess, the detective is damaged. Someone murdered his wife or his lover or his dog or his cat. Maybe he was raised by bats. I don't know. And I cannot say I can always predict the end of other people's mysteries, but I'm pretty good at guessing where the twist would come. And I may have pointed that out when these things were televised. And perhaps someone in my household said, well, why don't you try writing one? So I did. And I wish I could say it was easy. It was most definitely not easy. But anyway, I ended up with the Twin Cities Mystery Series. You could consider it Midwest noir or corn-fed noir, since both my detectives, Eric Jansson and Deb Metzger, though they work in Minneapolis and St. Paul, they were raised in Iowa. So yes, they've had their corn exposure. And my aim in this series is smart entertainment that has a soul, sort of the thrill of the genre but also a little bit of literary flair because I was indeed an academic. You may ask, why am I not writing academic mysteries? I'm in a town with 2 colleges, and not far from major state universities and a whole bunch. I mean, this Minnesota and Massachusetts share in common that they have an incredibly high density of learning institutions. But I think one reason why I wanted to write mysteries was to get away from that. So I've yet to have an academic in my novel. Also, though I'm here in Northfield, writing the series gave me a chance to explore the Twin Cities more, because if you're not actively working there, you think, oh, there are all these wonderful things going on, and I'm not getting to them. So it gave me a chance, a reason to go up there and explore a bit more. And I do like having a little distance between myself and my characters, myself and the circumstances of the crimes. To get back to that academic background, though, I had written serious academic stuff, particularly on poets, writers, and artists of New England, like Robert Frost, Elizabeth Bishop, Andrew Wyeth. And that does not necessarily make you a mystery writer. It does mean that I did have a keen sense of all the conventions of how plots were set up, how language was used. But as I learned from the first class I attended at the Loft on creative writing, and the Loft, as you may know, is the wonderful writing center in Minneapolis, is that the fear with scholars is that they're, 1, they'll be very boring. 2, they'll be very pretentious. And 3, well, back to boring. So anyway, it wasn't exactly encouraging to go. In fact, I sort of downplayed the academic writing I'd done. I had done a children's book years ago when my own children were small. So I did have that helping me. But as I said, the one thing academic background did give me is I knew how to slog through long projects. And writing mysteries can be a lot of fun, can be very exciting. You can do some very inventive stuff. But still, to come up with a manuscript between 80,000 and 100,000 words takes a lot of slogging, a lot of what they call chair glue. You have to just make yourself write it and make yourself revise it. But I also found this out, and I did, as I said, I did do several classes, 2 at the Loft, and one of them was taught by David Housewright. You may know, I'm sure you have his books in the library. And I think it was pointing out to somebody who was reading the opening of my first book. I said, well, I can see this happening. I can see it as a sort of procedural because it's very analytical. And you think, well, analysis belongs more in scholarly writing, but part of the appeal, I think, particularly of crime fiction that has detectives or sleuths in it, is that analytical side. If you ever read Edgar Allan Poe and his Dupin, his sort of French investigator, or certainly Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes, there's that quirky thought process going on. And yes, if you do it too much step by step, then it becomes clinical procedure, not fun procedure. And in a lot of mystery novels, there's a magical step that's sort of jumped over or left out. You don't know what's going on in Sherlock Holmes's mind when suddenly he figures it out. Or another classic mystery writer in the States, the Nero Wolfe series, set largely in New York. And Nero Wolfe is sort of like a heavy Sherlock Holmes. And his sidekick, Archie Goodwin, is sort of a lighter version of like a Philip Marlowe or Sam Spade kind of detective. But anyway, Nero Wolfe is sort of the genius sleuth in the armchair. But there's always a part of the book where suddenly he's figured everything out, but he hasn't told you yet. So even though it's step by step, you have that little mystery intuitive jump. And I've also noticed it's a very common trick in a series I sometimes watch when I'm feeling very cold and want to be warmed up. I don't know if you ever watched the series, is it Murder in Paradise or Death in Paradise? But there's always some very magical thinking at the end of that. And again, it's sort of the thought process with a sudden shock of intuition that might be caused by a leaky pen or something like that. But anyway, so, you know, there is an analytical side to mystery writing, and I think readers of that kind of fiction actually like that sort of, how are they going to figure out, you know, that sort of, what are they going to notice? Now, just because I had awareness of how mystery novels could work doesn't mean I could write one. It's one thing to be sort of aware that a plot has a beginning, middle, and end, and that characters must be in conflict somehow. And it's quite another thing to make that happen, to actually do a plot. I was telling a reporter the other day that it's a little bit like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, only you have to invent each piece as you get to it. So it's like, oh, I need to invent the piece that goes there. And to tell the truth, when I was sort of starting to think of these books about 7 or 8 years ago now, I don't think I would have even started, because I had it in my head that you had to have, as screenwriters do, you had to have that full outline, that full storyboard, and you had to plug your story into it. And I just couldn't see myself sitting down and coming up with, say, a 3-page outline for a mystery. There are writers who work that way. C.J. Box is one of them. But I happened to get, and I think it was in the Northfield Public Library, a short book by writer Walter Mosley, African-American mystery writer, and it's called This Year You Write Your Novel. And that's when I first heard in there terms that are very common in the mystery writing community: pantsers and plotters. Now I didn't know. Pantsers are writers who write by the seat of their pants. They just start writing. They may have a couple of ideas, they may have a one paragraph synopsis, but they kind of have to write to figure out what's going on. Where, you know, the plotters are the outliners. Tell the truth, everybody has to do a little of each going along the way. Sometimes just because I think it sounds better, maybe it's being pretentious, I like to call myself a builder, where I'll have some characters I've thought about, and I'll write maybe 40 to 70 pages, and then go back and sort of expand a synopsis from that. Then write maybe another 30, 40 pages, and then kind of rethink it again. In other words, I kind of have to have pretty good groundwork. I can't, even though I may have an idea of the ending, I just can't plunge ahead until I get a pretty good basis. It may have to be totally revised later. But anyway, that's, to come down to it, I started off sort of pantsing my way through it, just sort of starting with some ideas, taking off. It works very well for some people. I will say this, that my discovery method is slow. I am not the fastest writer. There are people who reliably write 1 to 2 books a year or more. Brian Freeman in Minnesota is one of those. You probably have some of your own favorites. You say, oh, good, it's not even a whole year, and this author's come out with another book. If you want me to take a sip of water from my very nice promotional cup. Another thing I might talk about for a few minutes is why write mysteries at all. I said, well, I was reading them, I was making fun of them. My husband's always been a big mystery writer, particularly since grad school, when he assisted a professor who studied Emerson and Thoreau, but this professor was writing a biography of Rex Stout, the man who wrote the Nero-Wolfe series. So my husband, in helping him research that biography, really got to know a lot about Rex Stout, hard-boiled detective fiction, noir detective fiction, and how that set up against sort of the British novels. So he had a lot of exposure there. I was really reading more different kind of stuff, from environmental literature to, you know, more literary novels. But as I matured, I guess you could say that in the evening, I tended to fall asleep a lot more easily, especially once the children left the nest and I could have a glass of wine. So I really needed books that went better with a glass of wine. I mean, that's kind of what it came down to. More of a page turner, I guess. So I sort of started reading more mysteries, including the Scandinavian noir. And mysteries, you can play with stereotypes. You've seen all kinds of series that maybe have fun with something that was established by Arthur Conan Doyle or by Raymond Chandler. I was talking to Jamie the other day, and I mentioned the TV series Monk. I don't know if any of you ever watched that, but that's sort of a variation on the quirkiness of Sherlock Holmes. You take somebody who's OCD, which makes him extremely attentive to details, but also adds in the way the actor Tony Shalhoub plays it, some very strange comic moments. So you can have a lot of fun with the genre. It can be escapist, but mysteries are often about justice or justice perverted. So one thing that did start me off was not just making fun of Scandinavian noir, but there were some real crimes that very much disturbed me. There still are real crimes that very much disturb me. And I've been involved in organizations in the area like United Way, organizations that help people on the margins, some that help women who've been victims, and men too, of domestic violence. So I knew some of the statistics. I knew some of the cases. I never worked with clients directly myself, but occasionally I read about them or I heard a presentation one of them might give. So I had that serious stuff going on. And as we've really learned the past year, the weight of news can be unbearable. And in some ways, for me, having a reason to confront it a little bit from the side, like, well, I need to know more about this topic for writing a mystery, like with sex trafficking. That gave me a way in. With Where Privacy Dies, one of the things that set me off is the data breach at Target. And also, some phone hacking. And I won't go into a specific case, but there was a very specific case in England that involved news reporters hacking into the phone of a murdered girl. And this became a scandal, one of many for the Rupert Murdoch Industries, because it was reporters that worked for those companies. For Should Grace Fail, if again, to just give you a backdrop, that mystery features detectives Eric Jansson and Deb Metzger, Hested the First. They're both tall, athletic, in their 30s. They're both attracted to women. I might come back to talking about them in a minute. But Should Grace Fail was influenced by a couple of different things. One is when the Super Bowl, which is happening, tomorrow? Whenever there's a Super Bowl in town or any kind of large event, there's concern about sex trafficking. And I believe when it was in Minneapolis a couple of years ago, there were over 90 arrests related to sex trafficking charges. Another thing I happened to read about, I read a series about rescuing some of the adolescents who get trafficked, or adolescents who move to the street because they've been kicked out or they become addicted to drugs. They are very hard to rescue because society in some ways already rejected them. They perhaps have had to do criminal things themselves just to survive. One thing I heard at a meeting of an organization I work with is that for some young women, all the sex they've ever had has been transactional. They may not call it prostitution because they're underage, but in other words, they'll go out with a guy because he will provide a bed and pizza and a beer for the night. And that's why they're going out with him. So that's getting into the dark side a little bit again. But so I'd read about the dangers of sex trafficking. I'd read about how difficult it is to rescue these people. There was also the backdrop of the difficulty of being a police officer set against police brutality. This book was finished before the killing of George Floyd. I don't think I could have written it. I don't think my publisher would have gone ahead with it if I'd been proposing it that week, because there is some racial tensions in this book. But I did have in the back of my mind, though these issues are not directly in the book, but I remembered the police shooting of Philando Castile, who maybe had a little marijuana on him, had been stopped, a traffic stop. He told the officer who stopped them that he had a gun and he was legally allowed to have that gun, but the officer panicked and shot him. It comes out later that I think the assumption is that the officer who shot him had taken a kind of police training on the side that focused more on policemen as warriors more than as community servants. I mean, I'm getting a little bit into the news a little bit, but I take that and I filter into a book that has, I hope, both dramatic sides, but also lightens it a little bit. I mean, one thing I try to do with Deb and Eric, who bounce off each other a little bit, is they have some pretty snarky remarks between the two of them. They sort of see the world in very different ways, where he's more of, he's a Minnesota type, those, Carolyn was saying earlier, those stern, sort of reticent Norwegians and Swedes. He's half Swedish, half Norwegian, and a little bit of something else. But, I grew up in that in Maine too. I was reading serious novelist Peter Heller. One of his books, he said of the state of Maine that reticence was the state flower. So I sort of grew up with those reticent types. So anyway, I'm throwing out quite a bit for you to think about there, but to get back to what I was saying about working with the conventions, to some extent, Eric Jansson, young, male, tall, handsome enough, he is a bit of a play on the Archie Goodwin, Philip Marlowe type detective, though he's very unlike, if you ever read John Sanford's Lucas Davenport novels. Lucas Davenport is clearly a bad boy. He will use his gun. And Eric isn't quite, on that page at all. And with Deb Metzger, well, she sort of worries that she's, particularly in the first novel, she worries that she is the cliche. She's sort of an angry, athletic lesbian. But part of her backstory, which is only touched upon in each novel, she has been treated with prejudice. People do react to her rather strongly, and she reacts rather strongly back. And also with Eric and Deb, Eric is more apt to keep his thoughts to himself. She tends to think out loud. So it's like he has to hear every thought she has, and she has to kind of shake him to find out what he's thinking. So I've got some little tension going on there. The other thing I might say about Deb is, on one hand, I say, yes, I was influenced by cliches, but she's actually based on at least 3 people I knew, 3 women. I did not know their sexual orientation. One was a student I once taught who participated in shot put, and she had these shoulders that were serious. And also, she had a kind of a manner that went with them. Another was, at one time I was teaching at night classes, this was in another state, attended mostly by adults, and one woman, a tall woman, said to me that she was picking up more credits so she could teach junior high or high school. She said, my real love was teaching kindergarten, but she said, but my voice is too deep. I terrify them. So with her deep voice, so I think of Deb as somebody who can come across as a little terrifying because she's got this athletic presence and is sort of a tall woman at least. But also a doctor in rural Maine, a woman, another tall woman with a deep voice, who was very much an advocate for the underserved. And with sort of, I won't go into the whole circumstances, but let's say my extended family, and this is true for many, some are very well-to-do, some did not make it to the middle class. And I think I had shown up for a family crisis, and she was essentially taking down another doctor for assuming that this was a patient that didn't really need attending to because there was so little in that person's life. So that's getting to the serious side again. As I said, mysteries often come out of some form of injustice. And those injustices may be small and somewhat comic, or they may be big. Or, I happen to be, this is what the pandemic and staying at home does to you. I happen to be rewatching a lot of Agatha Christie's. Watching seems a little easier than reading right now, but, she's the connoisseur of the toxic family, the rich toxic family, kind of a sick patriarchal setup. And that was sort of made fun of. And if you saw that movie last year, was Knives Out, it Christopher Plummer in it. You know, American Noir has its roots in prohibition, the development of gangs, also unions and union busting. Dashiell Hammett worked for a famous detective agency. Why can't I think of it? You can tell me later. But anyway, he was involved early on in some union busting and then sort of turned against that. The Pinkertons, that's what it was. Yes, they were to protect trains, but they were also, for a while, involved in union busting. So, you know, it could be a large injustice, it could be a small one. But that's sort of one thing that mysteries explore in an entertaining way. Well, I think I've said enough for a beginning, and maybe I'll see if some of you have questions or comments. Oh, muted. You're muted.
Okay, just put your, I'm going to mute everybody here, okay? Thank you. Questions for Priscilla? Don't be shy. I have a question for you, Priscilla. We talked about your research because I think that you spend a lot of time in the book detailing the geography of I want to say Minneapolis. How did you drive yourself around? Did you visualize certain neighborhoods? How did you come to kind of select the places that you did? I'm thinking as well of the hotels, the Nancy Leclerc and her hotels and so forth.
Well, I'll take I'll approach that from a couple of different angles. One thing is when you grow up in places like Maine, Minnesota, I mean, it's true of so many places, you often, you know, I grew up on very much in a Robert Frost landscape. You often have a very strong sense of place. And one of my academic interests was literature about the land and the environment. So I think I already came at that with a strong sense of place. And here's an irony about writing mysteries. On one hand, mysteries sort of thrive on an interesting sense of place, on the sort of, you know, London's fog, the, you know, San Francisco fog. I think in LA, it's the oil fields just outside the corrupt city of LA. But at the same time, it can be very hard to sell something if it seems too regional. I eventually did place my book with a independent press. And I think one thing that helped with that is the editor had grown up in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. So she didn't mind. She didn't think it was just uninteresting that one of the detectives was of Scandinavian descent. She didn't think that was necessarily a drawback to trying to sell it nationally. So there is that sort of paradox, I think, in mystery writing, which is mysteries thrive on a strong sense of place, be it Dennis Lehane's Boston, you know, certainly Chicago, New York has certainly been done a lot. But even, I know somebody who writes cozy set in Key West. So there is that. I did have a strong sense of place, and I think mysteries, readers often want that. But in terms of exploring, it did become kind of a fun game with my then college-age children, soon to be adult children, to let's go find a place to hide the body. You know, let's go with mom and see what would happen if you threw somebody off this parking garage. Is it tall enough to be fatal? So there was, you know, there was some exploring, and you know, I find the geography and architecture of the Twin Cities fascinating because it's a city of water, and Maine was a state of water. You have these major rivers. The Mississippi is a major working river. The Minnesota River, Minnehaha Creek, you know, that name came from a New England poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So it's both a very urban area with urban problems, but also it's a city of parks. And I was always fascinated by this wilderness right by the airport. There's a major national wildlife refuge that you fly over that you get to in 3 minutes from the Mall of America. And once you're down on that refuge, this is the opening of my first novel, you wouldn't know that the city was there, and you could easily get lost. It's a huge place. And yes, actually, after I published a book, a body was discovered in that refuge. They are every so often because they're washed up. Anyway, let's see what else they did. Well, Carolyn Jennings will understand this, but let's just say I have a life where I go to a lot of receptions. I do a lot of smiling. That may mean at some point you feel like killing people because you've been smiling so much. But I've been in a lot of hotel lobbies and a lot of hotel event spaces. And I think there was one hotel, I'll leave it nameless for 2 reasons. One, I can't remember the name. And 2, they did not want to host me for a book event. But I remember the wallpaper having like teepees and bears and walleye on it. And it was, a very funky boutique hotel. And I thought, I've got to use that in some way. Yeah, what could be more Minnesota than having walleye on your hotel wallpaper, even if it is an expensive hotel. So I think maybe that's one reason why the hotel got it in there. And again, researching sex trafficking, a lot of that occurs at high level and low level hotels. And most hotels, as a general rule, do not want that to happen. And I'm giving away my trade secrets here, but I was aware of the history of not a hotel person, but a hospitality industry person, Marilyn Carlson of, is it Wagon Lee Travel? She's retired now, but that family-run travel business, because of Marilyn's influence, is one of the very first to really get behind anti-trafficking measures. And there is something real called the code that people sign, that hoteliers, people in the hospitality industry sign on to have training so their employees are more aware of the signs of trafficking. This was, when I first started researching this novel, this wasn't quite as widespread. It's become much more widespread in the past couple of years, so more people are aware of it. But I think, I'm not saying she is Nancy Leclerc, she's not, but that on one hand, you can read, and I did actually read a fictional story where a hotel was sort of blamed for the trafficking that occurred. You do have people in the industry who very much want it not to occur. Now that's got me a little bit away from my research and my sense of place, but let's just say I've been to a lot of hotels. I almost had an event at the Marriott near the Mall of America because I said that in my book, the first book, the body was found near there, and that kind of interested me a great deal. But ended up going, I think with my first book, I did a small event at the Swedish Institute, which also seemed very appropriate. So again, I'm getting a little away from, but yes, I do drive around for Should Grace Fail, this one. I did a lot of eating out. I think, again, I was in the cities for something else, and I ate at the Wilde Cafe, named after Oscar Wilde. And it has a great view of the river and the Guthrie Theater. And I thought, well, got to do something with that. And they had duck fat French fries. So I have to do something with that. In Should Grace Fail, one character is mixed race. She has an African-American side and a Polish-American side. And I knew that there are these Polish-Ukrainian neighborhoods sort of on the side of the Mississippi with the Wilde Cafe. I think it's called the Northeast section or Northeast. In Minneapolis. And so I think I went to the Wilde Cafe, got some coffee in the morning, and then drove around to look at these neighborhoods, saw a Polish deli. But I also saw these huge energy company pylons that were rusted. And after all, it's the girl's Polish-American grandmother who lived there. And I saw a lot of Tudor-style cottages, very small. But somehow these very small working-class houses with these forest of rusted towers sort of caught my imagination. So I do drive around right a bit, and I have to admit that I have been frustrated this past year because I I feel cut off from eavesdropping in coffee shops. That's a great inspiration for almost any writer, eavesdropping in a coffee shop. Though, again, as I get older, I may need some computer assistance to do that. Not that I do anything illegal. And just driving around and seeing places, because yes, I check things out to see if what could actually happen there. Like I knew I wanted a scene in Should Grace Fail at the Minnesota Zoo. So I think this was a couple of years ago when a baby tiger had just been born. So I went with my bird camera, which has a big lens, a lonely adult, to the zoo, wandered around and thought, you know, you could be pushed into the tiger pit. You couldn't get out, but if somebody really wanted to push you in, that was doable. So I sometimes go places and make sure things are doable, though I still make up places. And I usually say somewhere, either when I'm talking about the book or in the introduction, that there is a mix of real places. I don't usually have the crime happen at a real address. That's too much of a burden to place on that address. Though I'll have something similar, like the hotels I mentioned in this book. I think I made up a chain called Leclerc, and it could be based on several that I either read about or went to in downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul. Another thing I depend on is realtor.com or niche.com. You know, Nancy Leclerc is a wealthy woman, and her house, the description is based on one I saw through realtor.com. You know, it can be hard to get into these exclusive neighborhoods, but if a house is for sale, if you don't want it or don't have the time to have a realtor show it to you, and they don't always appreciate people who aren't seriously buying, but you can find out, you know, now you get these like walk-through tours of houses online. Mm-hmm. So yes, Google is a writer's friend, though you can't trust Google. So anyway, yes, I think I've always had a strong sense of place, and I think it very literally grounds the story. Certain things can happen in certain places. Another research thing I did, and Carolyn, I know you're musical, you might be interested in this. The character Jay Lynn, the mixed race one, is a classical pianist. And through I saw on this Minneapolis paper that a master pianist from New York City was doing master class at, now here's where I get my real and fictional names mixed up, at the MacPhail Music Academy, which is very near, across the river from the Wild Cafe. It's that whole Mill Ruins Park area. And I got a ticket and went and saw who might be there. And actually, the young people who were performing for the teacher were all essentially mixed race. The star pupil, and this sort of gave me a piece for Jalen to play, was playing a Liszt piece, a young African-American man who to me was very light-skinned. There was also a woman who had some Hispanic background and one who had some Asian background. And I think their ages were like 12, 14, and 20. And they were playing for someone named Seymour Bernstein, who had been featured on like public television and the like. So I got to see sort of the repertoire they had. I got to see what it looked like in MacPhail. MacPhail makes a big commitment to being inclusive. And I got to see how close it was to the Mississippi River and the Lock and Dam, and places where, yes, people have gone into the water and not come out. So I know if you haven't read the book, this may all sound very mysterious, but most of the scenes you could reenact in a real place in the Twin Cities somewhere.
Wow. I want to also ask you about can I ask you something about Where Privacy Dies? I had no idea that there was a whole industry devoted to managing a person's reputation. I guess that was just
there is.
I had no idea. I knew maybe movie stars had agents, but managing your reputation?
I'm trying to think if there was a particular thing in a newspaper that alerted me to that. I may have just seen ads online, because I'm online a lot, aimed at medical doctors, because all it takes is one bad or untrue review, and a doctor's practice can start falling apart. So there is some truth of that. I may have been aware of it with, I can't remember which oil rig disaster it was right now, but I think it was BP used spokespeople, and that got mocked very much. But, you know, the one of the BP vice presidents said something like, "I just want to have my life back," which I'm sure was true. But as a person in power, he isn't allowed to have personal vulnerable feelings in a way, because he's been responsible for too much. So that's why they often have these spin doctors or spokesmen. If there's an outbreak of COVID in some place, the people dealing with it are sometimes too stressed to talk about it, or don't know how to present it in an honest way.
Yeah.
That yet is not going to provoke more scandal. So it's necessary, but it's also highly problematic because people can lie. And if you're wondering, if you haven't read Where Privacy Dies, there is a firm in there that helps manage the reputations of executives, politicians, so on, and also nonprofits. Nonprofits can need them too, because of all the many things that we said or discovered. I also happened to, I think, read in a newspaper a review of a book on opposition research, which is done mostly with political campaigns. And that book, which was written before, I think it was written before President Trump was elected in 2016. It may have come out in 2015 or 2016. Goes into, it sounds like it could be high style TV drama, and some of it is, you know, sort of spying on normal people, but it's also going into the records to see what a certain city councilman did 10 years ago. It can be very boring, and some of it can be irrelevant. Sometimes what a person did 10 years ago doesn't matter right now. I'm getting some kind of alert on my phone, ignore that. So anyway, yes, there's all kinds of organizations, colleges, universities, corporations, nonprofits, sometimes go to a spokesperson or a spokes group to help them craft statements. You know, the CDC probably could have had a better one.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that makes, I think there was also a TV show that ran for a while, Scandal, where it was people trying to manage other people's, sometimes they're called crisis managers, where they're not actually managing the details of the crisis, but the PR handling of the crisis. And as I said, it can have a very necessary and beneficial side, and it can help quell rumors, it can help prevent panic, but it can be a cover-up too.
Right. So it's really kind of to keep an individual, an organization in alignment with their public persona. Is that?
Yes. And sometimes there's a big gap between the public persona and what they're really doing, and sometimes not so much. I mean, you don't imagine a big gap with somebody like Anthony Fauci. You imagine there's pretty close alignment there, but you don't know. You know, I take Big Pharma. Big Pharma's in, you know, on one hand, they're miracle workers. They're saving us from so much pain and agony. They're coming out with these vaccines as fast as they can. They have to be careful. If one person gets sick from the vaccine, they have to be prepared to make a statement about that. So that's a good way to think of risk managers. Meanwhile, you know, was it Purdue Pharma and I did read a lot about the Sackler family.
Oh, yes.
And what was going on for Purdue. And I won't get into that, but it's just kind of like, is this the seeds of the opioid crisis, which is also touched on in Should Grace Fail, that a pharmaceutical company, once it became aware of how terribly addictive these prescription opioids was, didn't do enough to stop it. In fact, when competitors are trying to make similar opioid products, they got in the, well, I don't know, they did some relatively underhanded things. I can't remember now, and that's sort of a different story. But, you know, Big Pharma is one of those things where they can be big villains and they can be big saviors. And it can sometimes be very hard to know the truth, because they will have these filters of lawyers and spokesmen and risk managers. So I try to make that much more interesting in the book, Where Privacy Dies, and my actual talk about it right now. But what kind of person would do that is one of the big issues in Where Privacy Dies. What kind of person will speak up for somebody who's maybe not quite what they should be?
Yeah. One of the things that I appreciated in both the books and I found very interesting is, of course, there's the grind and the politics involved at the police station. Just the sheer hacking away at a case. It's like trying to break apart a big chunk of ice with an ice pick. And also the politics that went on with the privacy management. It was just this Machiavellian kind of an environment. So I found both of those very compelling myself. Both of those, there was nothing whitewashed about either location.
Right. I may have been having some fiction fun. I've not actually been in that kind of corporate world, but you know, some of the articles I read in the Wall Street Journal, I read some articles in the Wall Street Journal that helped shed light on that. And, you know, I think again, not directly as research, but I watched a couple of both fiction and nonfiction movies based on the 2008 financial collapse. I can't remember what they call it, like Short Money. And you kind of see that in those movies, both the fiction and the nonfiction ones. As I said, I have never been a police officer or an investigator. I don't think I ever will be. However, I've taught at about 10 different educational institutions. And if you want strange politics, look to education. and even in nonprofits. I was very involved for several years, and then I sort of timed out with a local humane society. And I was very interested in animal issues. And I went to one or two national conventions on humane issues. And guess what? You see the same politics among people who are dedicated to saving animals. It's like, no, this organization isn't doing it right. No, this organization isn't doing it right. No, this person in it just to self-aggrandize. No. So you get, so, you know, it's like, okay, to get back to the sort of Norwegian Scandinavian heritage, it's like, why is there a first Lutheran church and a second Lutheran church and then yet another Lutheran church in one small town? You know, it's like, even so-called like-minded people work in very different ways. So, so yes, I think, and I think one reason why I went with public investigators rather than, say, more of a Miss Marple, an amateur sleuth, is, I think because I did have that background in structures, and I kind of couldn't imagine myself. I could see something. Both my husband and I come from families where there's a strong sense of civic duty. You know, either commitment to, you know, I grew up in a very rural area. My father was a farmer, sold some real estate things on the side, but both he and my mother were very involved in the school system and very involved in an area that had very little for a tax base, trying to figure out a way to get a high school that could compete, you know, in that area, which meant bonding together 11 towns. And that, there was some politics in that. And there was some mudslinging even among these, you know, farmers to pull that together. But there's that sense that needed to be done. And so I think both my detectives, for somewhat different reasons, have that strong sense of duty and come from families where there's that sense of duty.
Mm-hmm. Carol, anything you want to chip in? Say?
No, I haven't read the books, so I can't say anything about them.
Do you want to talk a bit about your books?
Well, I wasn't really prepared to do that, but mine is an amateur sleuth and an academic. So just what you were trying to avoid there.
You've got it covered. That's why I didn't need to do it.
And most of them are based on real incidents that happened at various universities or schools that I've been associated with. So I start with an incident and then insinuate my person into into the thing. But I'm just fascinated because I just finished doing a series of 4 Minnesota books with my book group. And, you know, had I but known, to use a cliche, you know, it would have been fun to include yours. I did fall back on Virgil Flowers of John Stanford for, you know, for want of another, but used Kruger and Housewright and P.J. Tracy for the others. So.
Oh, yes. I think P.J. Tracy graduated from St. Olaf College in Northfield.
Yeah.
I'm acquainted with her. William Kent Kruger once bought me a glass of wine when we were stranded at a conference. He's a very outgoing and very nice man. As I said, I took a class from David Housewright. The one thing I might add, and you may already be aware of this, but you know, mystery writers can have a lot of fun too. And I've been talking more about the serious topics like corruption and spin doctoring and racism and things like that. And where privacy dies, one of the major clues is found in a kitty litter box. And even in Should Grace Fail, it's sort of you know, like a dollar bill that one young person throws at another. And you know, yes, the tiger, you know, going to see the baby tiger turns out to be more adventurous than they thought. So, you know, and I'm sure you do with your books too. There are the lighter moments, and as I said, I've met most law enforcement that I've met through working with something like United Way Agency or a women's agency, and you know, one of them I just simply think of in my head as the fun sheriff. He's just a really fun guy and has a great sense of humor. So, but yeah, I'll have to look for your books as well, because yes, the academic world there's a lot of material there.
Oh, yes. So, other than that, I don't have anything to say, except I'm glad to find out about your books. And that's why I tuned in today.
Carolyn, Roberta, any questions, comments, reflections?
Well, if we were through with other main questions, I would ask if there's a way you might check and see if Roberta and I could get past where we are apparently stuck in not a view that we wanted to be. But I will say, Priscilla, that when you talked about writing by the seat of your pants, it made me think of something similar for my writing music, and that would be not that concept, but writing by intuition. And when I get to a certain point, look there, when I get to a certain point and I know it's right, that's my working through intuition, and something comes of it. So I felt that some similarity there with you. Thank you.
And music and dance have a wonderful physicality where once you start, the senses give you feedback. Writing's more abstract, but even in writing, and I'm in this category too, the physical act. I mean, there's, you know, and you may know about this, Carol, like NaNoWriMo, the Write a Novel in a Month organization, where, and I tried it this year and I did not get 50,000 words. It still doesn't quite suit me, but essentially it's like, write something, write anything, just start writing. Because one thing I have observed in going to different, both literary conferences and conferences, not just on mystery writing, but writing in general, I have heard a number of wonderful beginnings that made me so envious. I thought, why couldn't I write that beginning? But then the middle and the end never came from that writer. And so it's that, as you say, you may be starting off by the seat of your pants, and you just have to keep following that. One of the best things I heard was you got to write a lot of bad stuff before you can produce something good. Not just as practice, but just you got to be trying out a lot. And some writers, that's less true than others. I'm still pretty much a novice at novel writing, and I have to try out a lot.
So you're working on another book right now, Priscilla, is that correct?
Yes, and I had an idea in mind that would involve a 911 dispatcher. I thought it was a pretty good idea, though it may have been more of a short story idea. And I started reading memoirs by 911 dispatchers. It was very informative, very tough life, a lot of traumatic stress disorder, very sympathetic to it. But I read one of the books I read, I was just really put off by the writer, who eventually was actually fired from that job. But, and I thought, and for some reason, even though that wasn't a major thing, and I'm usually pretty open to reading all kinds of people, including people I don't like, for some reason, it just didn't click then. But homelessness did. Maybe because we had to move suddenly because the house we were in, which was owned by a college, suddenly had this major plumbing issue. One of my children was moving, and there's been, you see in all the cities, but Minneapolis and St. Paul too, homeless encampments. It's become a real issue during the pandemic. And somehow home and homelessness ended up resonating with me more. So I still have the 911 idea that I'm setting aside. It might be a better short story. But that, and sometimes you just see a person, like I saw a musician who suggested the character Jay Lynn in Should Grace Fail. And I saw a realtor agent who is also involved in nonprofits who suggests a character in my upcoming novel. And also in Should Grace Fail, I saw a woman who's not what she did, but the way she looked gave me sort of details for the Nancy Leclerc character. And Carol, I probably assume it's the same for you. Sometimes it's just a glimpse of something or one story, I don't know, or a particular, like you say, a particular incident that sets you off, or a particular personality, maybe, good or bad.
Yeah, my characters are all based on people I know or composites of people I know. So I'm much more an incident, that will set me off. I have to say, talking about this writing, I have a book that has a beginning and an end and no middle. And it's been that way for about 4 years. And I keep thinking this is the golden opportunity to fill that in. And it just hasn't happened. So I have to go now, though. I'm sorry.
No,
Well, thank you for coming, and I'll look up your...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Carolyn, may I suggest to you that that we touch base after this event sometime this week? Are you using a laptop computer?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so and do you have a library card?
Yes.
Okay, I'll look up your account. I'll get a hold of you and we'll figure out how to get your webcam going, okay?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that I can do Zoom right one idea right after the next, but
Huh.
this is an entirely different system and I'm not familiar with it. And
Okay.
so I don't even know which screen to be looking for.
Okay, well, we'll sort that out.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Carol.
Priscilla, I want to thank you for your generosity. It's
Thank
been
you.
fascinating for me to hear you and to learn more about you. And again, I want to thank you. This has been so interesting, and you're very generous, and I hope to keep in touch with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.